Hello dear students, welcome to the lecture series on the subject botany. Today we have selected an interesting topic, that is plant movements. In this lecture, I will be first of all introducing the topic plant movements. Then we will have a brief discussion on the process of plant movements. And then we will discuss in detail the different types of plant movements. Let us first of all have an introduction to this topic, plant movements. Unlike animals, plants always remain fixed at one place and therefore they are immobile. However, we see certain kinds of movements do occur in plants, but these are generally too slow and remain unnoticed to a human eye. Nevertheless, these movements can be observed at the interval of several hours by noticing these changes in the position of various plant organs. In fact, more than a century ago, Charles Darwin, famous evolutionary biologist, and Francis Darwin, they wrote a book entitled The Power of Movement in Plants in the year 1880. This book first of all recognized that plants, although rooted to the soil, exhibit a range of fascinating movements. In fact, before Darwin's, the scientific studies on plant movements were pioneered by Julius von Sachs. Julius von Sachs is credited with the invention of clinostate. This clinostate was later on used to study the various types of plant movements. Process of plant movement. The movement of plants or their parts in response to some agency or some factor is quite an interesting phenomenon. The agency, or we may call it a factor, such as light, touch, chemicals, temperature, gravity, water, etc., which cause movement. It's called a stimulus. Broadly, plant movements are accomplished in three main steps. Number one is perception. Number second, transduction. And number third, response. Firstly, the stimulus always acts on some internal plant machinery. And the plant part that perceives this stimulus is called the receptor. Secondly, once the stimulus has been perceived, it is transduced into some form of a signal. Then thirdly, the signal leads to some motor response that is the actual cause of the plant movement. All the parts of a plant do not act as the site of perception to the stimulus. It's the plant structures or organs that are capable of perceiving the stimulus. They are called as perception sites. The structure that acts as the site of perception is not always that site which responds to the movement. In fact, we have seen in many cases the site of response and the site of perception are quite different. Usually, there is a time lag between the time at which the stimulus is applied and the time at which the response, that is the movement, begins. This lag time is called as reaction time. This reaction time may vary and it depends upon the intensity of the stimulus and the kind of the response. If the stimulus is weak, there may not be any response at all. But if the stimulus is adequate, the response is positive. The time which is required to cause the proper stimulus is called as presentation time. Once the plant responds to the stimulus, plant structures which are involved, they always come back to their original position. This process is called recovery, and the time required is referred to as relaxation time, which again varies from species to species. All these events initiate with a signal, and the receptor that receives the signal becomes active and induces a signal transduction pathway within the cells. A cascade of such events finally leads to the response what we see in the form of plant movements. Types of plant movements. This part of the lecture we will discuss in detail. Although the power of movements in plants may not be very pronounced, yet it is brought about by definite external and internal stimuli. Based on this, whether the stimulus is internal or external, plant movements can be classified into two main types. Number first, autonomic. Number second, paratonic. Let us discuss these two broad types one by one. First, the autonomic. It is also called as spontaneous movement. It is a plant movement which occurs due to the factors which are inherent inside the plant body. The autonomic movements can be subdivided into three main kinds. Number first, locomotion movements. Number second, curvature movements. And the third one, growth movements. Now let us discuss these one by one. Locomotion movements. Movement in plants does not involve locomotion as we observe in animals. However, locomotion in plants may be at the level of protoplasm or organ level, or even the whole body, as we see in unicellular organisms, can show this locomotion. The common locomotion movements in unicellular organisms which are accomplished by naked protoplasm include: number one, ciliary movements, amoeboid movements, cyclosis, and gliding movements. Curvature movements. The higher plants generally remain immobile at one place, but they change the direction of their organs by means of curvature. The movement of curvature are called as mechanical if they are the result of physical cause. For example, hydration or dehydration of cell walls. Or these are called as vital movements if caused by vital activities of living cells. Third type of movements are growth movements. These are the outcome of unequal growth of plant organs. Plant structures such as tendrils and stem tips exhibit differential growth. This differential growth results either in sideward or circular movements. We have seen certain subcylindrical stems, they show a zigzag movement due to the differential growth at the sides. On the other side, growth activity takes place around the cylindrical tendrils in search of getting a hold onto a substratum. That's why it appears as if it is moving in circles. Such type of movement is called as circumnutatory movements. The growth activity of these structures is inbuilt and they show a particular rhythmic pattern. Paratonic, or sometimes also called as induced movements. These are the plant movements which occur due to external stimulus. The paratonic movements can be categorized into three main kinds. Number one, taxis. Number second, tropic movements. Number third, nastic movements. Let us discuss these paratonic movements one by one. Taxis movements. These are also sometimes called as tactic movements. These tactic movements are commonly observed in lower plants. These tactic movements include those movements where an organism, most often we have seen single or fused, and rarely an organ moves towards or away from some stimulus. Some of the familiar taxis movements are phototaxis, thermotaxis, chemotaxis. Phototaxis. It is a movement that is brought about in response to light. For example, the weak light usually attracts and strong light repels the mobile algae. For instance, When a unicellular algae is suspended in a test tube, it moves towards the light source to obtain solar energy for photosynthesis. If the light is very intense, they move away from the light. The movement in these organisms is brought about by locomotor structures such as flagella or cilia. The beating of these structures such as flagella or cilia propels the cell towards light. Thermotaxis. These are the movements which are shown in response to heat. For example, rapid circulation or rotation of protoplasm in the gently warmed tissues. Usually the lower organisms sense the temperature and move towards the compatible temperature, or they can move away if the temperature is incompatible. Chemotaxis. These are the movements which are brought about due to some chemical substances. For example, many flagellated or non-flagellated bacteria move towards the source of food by lashing their flagella or by tumbling. In these cases, the stimulus is purely chemicals. Similarly, the movement of spermatozoids in the lower organisms such as mosses, ferns is always directional because the chemicals released by the mature orchigonia provide the chemical stimulus. Sensing the chemicals, the flagellated spermatozoids swim towards the orchigonia and enter the neck canal cells and bring about fertilization. It is the presence of chemicals such as sucrose, malic acid, which are present inside the orchigonium that attract the spermatozoids. Tropic moments. In this case, the direction of stimulus determines the direction of the movement. In other words, tropic movements are directionally related to the stimulus. The response may be in the same direction as the stimulus, in the opposite direction, or it can be at some specific angle to the stimulus. Thus, the tropic responses may be either positive or negative. If a plant responds in the direction of the stimulus, for example towards a light source, it is said to be positive. If it grows away from the stimulus, it is said to be negative. Some familiar tropic movements which have been studied in detail include: number 1, phototropism, gravitropism, and thermotropism. Let us discuss these one by one. Phototropism. In fact, one of the commonly observed examples of phototropism is the bending of indoor house plants towards the light source from an open window. Phototropism is often defined as a response to unilateral light. However, in natural conditions, the bending response can also occur in plants that receive light from all the sides. In such cases, it is the unequal distribution of flux rate on different sides that makes a light gradient. Therefore, phototropism is more precisely a growth response to a light gradient. The phototropism can be positive or negative. That largely depends upon the nature and age of plant organ. For example, in most cases, stems and other aerial parts of plants, they are positively phototropic. However, the stems of ivy, scientifically known as Hedera halex, during their juvenile stage, they are negatively phototropic. But the older branches here show positive phototropism. Generally, the roots in plants, they are negatively phototropic, but the leaves are plagiotropic. What does this plagiotropic means? It means that they orient at angles intermediate to the light. Also, the tendrils of most of the climbers, they are negatively phototropic. Phototropism is mostly exhibited by stem tips, as they are always bending towards the light source. In essence, it is a below light response. As we have seen, the action spectrum of the light has been found to be at the blue light. The pigment for absorption of blue light is the cryptochrome. It is now known that the blue light brings about unequal distribution of active oxygens than the total oxygen content. This difference in the quantity of active oxygen brings about differential growth. Gravitropism. We all know that the roots always grow down and the stems always grow up. Such a growth of roots towards soil and the stem away from the soil is in response to the gravitational force of the earth, and it is one of the familiar plant phenomenon known as gravitropism. The root and shoot of the primary plant axis always align parallel with the direction of gravitational pull, termed as orthogravitropism. The primary root, which grows towards the center of the earth, shows a positive gravitropism, and the shoot, which grows away from the center of the earth, shows a negative gravitropism. Other plant organs such as stolons, rhizomes, which grow at right angles to the pull of gravity, are referred to as diagravitropic. Plant organs such as lateral stems and lateral shoots, which are usually oriented at some intermediate angle between 0 degree and 90 degree to the vertical, are said to be plagiogravitropic. The differential response of stem tip and the root tip to the same gravitational force is due to their different innate structural and functional potentials. The mechanism of gravitropism has been ascribed to the different concentration of oxygens. Thermotropism. It involves the response of many plant organs, especially tendrils, to the stimulus of touch. Plants with weaker stems, such as climbers, they require support for their growth. That's why they have developed hooks, pads and tendrils for getting a firm foothold onto the substrate. For example, in the case of tendrils of cucurbits, the terminal regions are very soft and tender, and they consist of a number of fine pits which are highly sensitive to the touch. When the tendril comes in contact with any supporting structures, the pits get stimulated and the same is transmitted a few millimeters basally. This results in the differential growth of the tendril on one side, which causes the curvature in the tendrils, and finally they coil around the supporting structure. Once the initial reaction is set in at the basal region, the tendrils coil around the support and thus draw the climber nearer to the support. Over the years, several other tropic movements have been described. Some of these include growth of plant organs towards the water, what is known as hydrotropism. Also towards certain chemicals, what is called as chemotropism, or sometimes electric current, known as electrotropism, and also the humidity gradient, what is called as hygrotropism. Gnostic movements. In this case, the direction of the stimulus does not determine the direction of the movement. In other words, directionality of Gnostic movements is inherent in the tissues and is unrelated to any vector in the stimulus. Gnostic responses may involve differential growth, in which case the movement is always permanent. Epinasty and thermonasty are the two common examples of Gnostic responses which are permanent, and they involve differential growth. Epinasty involves the downward bending of an organ. Commonly we have seen the petioles and leaves whose tips are inclined towards the ground. It depends on an unequal flow of oxygen through the upper and lower sides of the petiole. It is caused by more rapid growth of cells on top of the petiole than on the bottom. The reverse of epinasty is called as hyponasty, which involves upward bending of an organ. as the cells on the bottom side of the petiole grow much faster. It is less common in plants but can be induced by gibberellins. A typical example of thermonasty is the repeated opening and closure of some flower petals. Commonly, we have seen this movement, thermonasty, in tulips and crocus. In spite of their repeated nature, the movements are permanent and result from alternating differential growth on the two surfaces of the petals. Alternatively, the nastic movements may also be reversible, which are caused by differential turgor changes in specialized motor organ called pulvinus. Its plural form is pulvini. The pulvinus is basically a bulbous structure commonly seen in the plant families characterized by doubly compound leaves. These families are, for example, Fabaceae, Oxalidaceae. It occurs at the base of the petiole. Petiole is the stalk of the leaf, and it contains a number of large thin-walled motor cells which alter the position of the leaf by undergoing reversible changes in turgor. These can be broadly categorized into two main types. Number one is referred to as nyctinasty. Number second, seismonasty. Nyctinasty. The scientific observations of nyctinastic movements in plants can be traced back to Swedish botanist by the name of Carolus Linnaeus in the year 1775, who coined the term plant sleep for this phenomenon. And today, these are commonly called as sleep movements. The nyctinastic movements or the sleep movements are quite noticeable in leaves that exhibit a differential position during day and night. In many plant species, typically the leaves or leaflets, they are in horizontal or open position during the daytime and assume a more vertical or closed orientation during night. Therefore, these movements represent a rhythmic process and are controlled by interactions that go between, on one side, the environment and on other side, the endogenous biological clock. The plant species with doubly compound leaves most often exhibit strong nyctinastic movements. In such type of plants, each leaf bears several pinnae, and each pinnae in turn bears several pairs of opposite pinnules. Pinnules are actually the leaflets. These leaflets are attached to a single stalk, what is called as rachilla. Examples include the silk tree, scientifically known as Albizia julibrisens. One more example, common example, is sensitive plant. Scientific name is Mimosa peduca, and the rain tree, Samania saman. During the night time, the tips of the opposite leaflets in the silk tree, they fold together. That means they close, rise upwards and point towards the distal end of the rachilla. However, the leaflets in one more example, that is the rain tree, they fold down. In either of these cases, the cells in the pulvinus that swell during opening are called as extensors, whereas those that shrink are called as flexors. The second type of nastic movements are seismonasty. A large number of plants that possess these pulvini, they exhibit a response to mechanical stimulation called as seismonasty. These plants respond to a variety of stimuli including shaking, wind, raindrops, wounds by cutting, and intense heat or burning. Since the seismonastic movements are also responding to the touch, they are commonly referred to as thigmonastic movements as well. The best and common example of seismonastic movements is the tropical shrub commonly known as touch me not, scientific name Mimosa peduca. The plant is very sensitive to touch, rather the shock generated by the touch. The touch me not plant has pinnately compound leaves with a swollen pelvinus at the base of every leaflet. On touching the leaf, it leads to a seismic shock, and this stimulus is transmitted all along the rachis downwards and reaches the basal pelvinus of the leaf. This irritability caused due to touch is actually transmitted through sieve tubes, which are capable of transmitting the stimulus as fast as 1.5 to 20 centimeters per second. The material basis for stimulus has been found to be abscisic acid, a plant hormone, and sometimes abscisic acid mediated ions. The mechanism of upward movement of pinnules, that the leaflets, and downward bending of the entire leaf at the base is due to the activity of the motor cells found within the pelvinus. These cells contain many contractile vacuoles which are loaded with potassium ions when the leaflets are open. These motor cells are highly sensitive and active. When the stimulatory hormone abscisic acid, which is released due to the irritability, reaches these specialized cells, they are stimulated to contract, collapse and extrude the water and potassium ions into the intercellular space. This action brings about the collapsing of the cells on this side and the leaf downwards. Similar mechanism is involved in the folding of leaflets upwards. So dear students, in today's lecture, we discussed an interesting topic of botany, that is plant movements. We first of all had a brief introduction to the topic, then we discussed the process of plant movements, and lastly we discussed in detail the various types of plant movements. Hope you have better understood the topic and you have enjoyed it as well. For today, I will take your leave now. Hope we meet again with some other topic next time. Till then, goodbye.